Hi everyone, Mrs. Below here. In this video I'm going to be going over dihybrid crosses. So up until this point we've been talking about monohybrid crosses, which is when you are crossing two parents, two organisms together and looking at the possible outcomes of the offspring for one particular trait using one allele or one letter to represent that allele. In a dihybrid cross, we're going to be looking at two different traits at the same time. So first, we're going to see the results of a cross between two homozygous plants for two different traits. So in this case, we're looking at pea color and pea texture. So we have the dominant one, which is, we're going to represent that with two capital R's, two capital Y's. Okay, so this organism is dominant for both traits, this pea plant. So it is yellow, which is the dominant color. We've been talking about that for the peas. And then it is also round or smooth, which for texture is the dominant form of that trait. Versus the recessive form for both traits would be green. That's a recessive form for color for the pea plants. And wrinkled, which is the recessive texture for peas. So one organism is dominant for both traits, yellow and smooth, and the other organism, the other pea plant, is recessive for both traits, green and wrinkled. And if we cross them together, the F1, the first filial or the first generation, so these offspring in here, are all going to be the same, and they are all going to be, F1 is heterozygous for all those traits. So all of them are heterozygous. So you could see in the offspring, all of them are heterozygous for both traits. So all of these offspring here, they would be yellow and smooth. So they would all look like this guy here, but they are all carrying the recessive allele because they are heterozygous. So now let's take two of these plants, two of those pea plants, two of the offspring, and breed them or cross them together. Yes, this is inbreeding, but who cares? They're plants. So now we're going to take this heterozygote from this generation up here, the F1 generation. We're going to cross it with another just like itself, okay? Now this looks a little different because we're talking about two traits now at the same time. And again, each parent can pass on one letter or one allele to the offspring. So you can see here, these are all the possible alleles that can be passed on to the offspring, okay? Either they can give a big R and a big Y. They can give a little r and a big Y. Big R, little y, and then, big R, little y, and then little r, little y, okay? Because you can get one allele from each parent. When you do this, if you cross for any dihybrid cross between organisms that are heterozygous for two different traits, you actually will always get the same ratio, which hopefully you've been noticing that with any hybrid cross. When we've been doing the hybrid cross here, between two, or I'm sorry, the cross between two heterozygotes, we're always getting the same ratio. That was actually the same thing in the homework. Let's find it right here. Okay, you get that 1:1 and then 3:1 ratio. That's also what we saw here, 1:1, 3:1. So whenever you do like the same type of cross, you're going to get the same ratio or the same results. So in this case, we're doing a cross between two organisms that are heterozygous for two different traits. So we're not just talking about this, we're also talking about this. Okay, so what we do is we can combine those together into one large Punnett square, because again, you get one allele or one trait from each of the parents. So this parent can pass on the big R. This parent could also maybe pass on the big R, and then he could pass on maybe the little y and like the big Y. Like that could be a possible outcome. But you get one allele from each parent. We're just looking at two at the same time. And whenever you do this type of a cross between two organisms that are heterozygous for two different traits, you will always get this ratio, 9:3:3:1. Now note that this is the phenotypic ratio. So this is talking about, the 9 is talking about how many are dominant for both traits. So the 9 is dominant, dominant. So they're dominant for both traits. So in this case, yellow and round. The 3 in this case is dominant for one trait, but recessive for the other. Again, looking, okay? We're not talking about the genotype, we're talking about the phenotype. So in this case, 3 will be, out of the 16, there's 16 total in this Punnett square, will be yellow and wrinkled. So yellow is the dominant color, but wrinkled is the recessive for texture. And then kind of have the vice versa of that, so to speak. So you'll have 3 that are recessive, so for the opposite trait, so green, but then dominant for the other trait, which is texture, which is smooth. So 9 are dominant for both traits. 3 and 3 are dominant for one trait but recessive for the other, and they're the vice versa of each other. So technically 6 altogether are dominant for one trait, recessive for the other trait. And then you'll only get 1 that is recessive for both traits. So make sure that you know what the ratio is, 9:3:3:1, but also what it means. Again, it's a phenotypic ratio, so we're talking about what they look like, not about their genotypes. And then, again, what that means. 9, dominant, dominant, so dominant for both. 3 and 3, they're dominant for one trait, but recessive for the other, and they're the vice versa of each other. And then 1 is recessive for both traits. All right, so what if we don't do that type of cross? What if we don't cross two organisms that are heterozygous for both traits and we can't use the 9:3:3:1 ratio? How are we going to do that? So we can still, if we look at the cross, we can still determine the genotypes and phenotypes of the offspring. All right, so here we're talking about, I think, guinea pigs. Yeah, guinea pigs is the example. So we can have hairy and bald guinea pigs. So hairy will be dominant, bald will be recessive, and then they can have spots or no spots. Spots will be dominant, no spots will be recessive. All right, so looking at the result of the offspring here, so we had a cross between two guinea pigs, okay? And we have to answer these questions down below. So how many of the offspring are hairy with spots? Okay, well, we know that hairy is the dominant trait, so we're going to look for anything that has a capital letter. And then spots is also dominant, so we're going to look for anything that has a capital S. Now this is talking about phenotype. not genotype. So we just have to identify how many have capital H's and capital S's. So this one does, so that's 1. This one does, that's 2, 3, 4. This one has a little s, little s, little s, little s. Those don't count. These ones, this one has little h's. Those don't count. Okay, so I count 6 total. That would be hairy with spots because hairy is dominant. So it'd have the capital H. As long as it has that, it will express the dominant trait, which is hairy, and then as long as it has the capital S, it will express the dominant trait, which is spots. All right, how many offspring are hairy with no spots? So again, hairy, capital H, so no spots is recessive, so that's going to be 2 little s's. So I have to count how many have a capital H and 2 little s's. So dominant for one trait, but recessive for the other. So that's 4 there. We have some more over here. All right, so that's also a total of 6. All right, how many offspring are bald with spots? So remember, bald is recessive, so it's going to be 2 little h's. And then spots is dominant, which will be a capital S. So we have to look for the ones that have 2 lowercase s's, or 2 lowercase h's. So these 2, and a capital S for spots. So there's only 2 of them that do. How many offspring are bald with no spots? So that would be recessive then for both traits, because bald is recessive and having no spots is also recessive, and there's only 2 of them here. So you have to just keep in mind you're looking at 2 traits at the same time. But again, the same rules apply with like dominant, recessive, homozygous, heterozygous. Those things still apply what we talked about with monohybrid crosses. It's just with dihybrids, you're looking at 2 traits at the same time.